Chapter 8, Section 2, Reforming American Society, Slavery and Abolition. During the 1830s, more and more whites were beginning to support abolition just as the slave movement for abolition grew among slaves. This was all happening in the North since the South was basically supporting the slaves because that was their economy, that was the way that they lived. But William Lloyd Garrison was a very important abolitionist. His newspaper, his newspaper, The Liberator, called for emancipation of slaves. He was also the first white person to speak of this in public. He wanted slavery to be abolished immediately, not progressively like others intended. Other abolitionists also urged for the end of slavery. David Walker urged slaves to fight. He himself was a slave who was able to flee from the north to the south. From the south to the north, my bad. Probably one of the most famous abolitionists was Frederick Douglass. He was a slave who was educated. But how was he educated? Simple. His master's wife made the biggest mistake of teaching him how to read and gave him the knowledge and power to think for himself. He was taught to read and write by the wife of his owners. He was able to get a job as a ship caulker and made good money, but his owner did not like this and took all the profit for himself, which was his every paycheck for every week. Frederick Douglass managed to escape his plantation and went to New York. There, he read William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. He became a great leader of the abolitionist movement. He founded a newspaper called the North Star, in which he spoke about abolition and urged nonviolence for freedom. Obviously, a lot of the whites in the South didn't like this at all. In the early days of slavery, however, most slaves were male and didn't speak English. They didn't know any other language, and they were usually from Africa or the Caribbean, where they didn't understand each other, so they couldn't communicate with each other. They all worked in small farms, but as time went by, more and more slaves were born in America, and most spoke English, which was starting to become a problem. By this time, there were now more plantations, and more slaves worked in these plantations in the field from sunup to sundown. It was an all-day thing, no matter what. Some slaves worked inside the homes as like butlers and housemaids to take care of the children or cook dinner or just do simple housework stuff. Other slaves had skills like in carpentry or blacksmithing and worked in the cities. Others worked in mines, mills, and lumber yards, which were all pretty grueling. If you ask me, I would not want to ever do that in my life. However, in 1831, Nat Turner led a group of slaves in a violent rebellion that left several dead. It was kind of like Shays' Rebellion. That's where a lot of whites were afraid. This is what they wanted to prevent. They didn't want this to happen. They attacked they attacked five different plantations in an area. The Turner Rebellion gave way to a bill in the Virginia state government to abolish slavery, but it was defeated by a narrow margin. This loss ended the discussion of abolition in antebellum America, which antebellum is pre-Civil War. So this all happened before the Civil War, but this started to see the Civil War. This is where things were starting to get a little tight between the North and the South. In southern states, however, slave codes were introduced. These codes restricted slaves even more than what they already were. They couldn't preach, testify in court, own property, or learn to read or write. Some people thought that slavery was good for the slaves. There were even some Southerners who preached the idea of a happy slave, which was a myth to kind of misguide everybody. They said the slaves in the South were happy because the plantation owners took care of them for the entirety of life, of their life. But Christians soon realized that slavery and their Christian beliefs could not live or co-opt together with whatever. Congress continued to push for abolition, but however, the gag rule was established. The gag rule allowed for no discussion of any topic, and slavery was no longer discussed in court. So this obviously worked for the South. Luckily, however, abolition did succeed thanks to all the abolitionists that fought so hard for the movement. But even after the Civil War and everything, until the '60s by uh, Martin Luther King Jr., nothing really improved for them. They were still treated like they were nothing, like treated like garbage, basically.